it's Velasquez, and we're ready to kick off our next video lecture. And today we're going to go and focus on a document that ended our discussion of World War I and definitely leads us to our continued discussion as we get closer to World War II. So please make sure you have your notebook out, you have a pen or pencil in hand, and let's go and get started with the Treaty of Versailles. All right, before we jump in, let's go and take a look at an image I posted on the computer screen. So this is a political cartoon we're going to take a look at when we start diving into our DBQ. Now, hopefully approaching political cartoons at this point, right, we're practicing our observations. What does it say, right? What is the evidence showing us? Hopefully we're asking a series of questions, right? Learning starts with questions, especially if we're trying to question like a historian. And then ultimately, if we can start to make sense, right? We're making some inferences or some predictions of how this could relate to our discussion of end of World War I, which is leading us or helping cause World War II. So a lot of people looking at the cartoon, right, they observe a figure that seems to either been crawling out, or some would say maybe the way the hand is positioned could also be kind of backing into a treaty, rolled up. Question perhaps you're asking is the size of the figure. Okay, seems to be small, or the treaty seems to be large, right? They're in proportion, so that's interesting to know. So what does that mean? Also the figure, what it's wearing, and a lot of people will note the hat that says the Hitler Party. You also recognize up here the helmet style. Remember in World War I, if you see that point, that signifies that was a German helmet. The mustache will signal, again, some maybe references to your connection of World War II. All right, so this is a fun one to take a look at. Now, we also looked at a different cartoon when we started our discussion of World War I. Now, this is an interesting one, right? We see all the figures of the countries on the stage, right? We have England, we have Belgium, we have Russia, Germany, Austria, Serbia, Italy, and France. Whew. With the caption at the top, the crime of the ages, who did it? So now, again, on the other side of World War I, perhaps you're making some connections of what that refers to. Why do we see certain countries pointing at each other? Why do we see the figure in the back, right? The piece of Europe has been murdered. And then the ominous hand to the side left, right, with the title, I should say, Chicago Tribune as the source. So maybe a nod to the United States. So there's lots of things, right, we can play with just now with our backstory of understanding World War I better. Another image to connect to, right, when we started with World War I, in addition to the tangled alliances, the national pride, the imperialism, remember we connected back to our main. The spark or the trigger we referenced was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which occurred June 1914. Now this murder tragically, of course, loss of life of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, but it also again set in place that chain reaction we looked at, which again, by the summer of 1914, we see the two powers are put in place, right? We have the Allied powers or Allied countries that are sort of faced and put against, again, the Central Powers. Now, two sides of fighting we've taken a look at in this case. We've looked extensively along the Western Front, which is the establishment of trench warfare. We've also briefly, again, through your different research, through your battle slides and your reading, understand that the Second Front was on the east, and then that was the war between Germany and Russia primarily. Now, Germany, remember, was put in that tough position initially through the Schlieffen Plan. They thought perhaps they would be able to attack France first, and then again, it would take longer for Russia to mobilize. Russia, they thought, would be a little bit slower in pace, but we see that Russia, for various reasons, including the struggles which are going to lead to a Russian Revolution, proved to be no match to the German forces. Now, when we looked at the trench warfare, we analyzed a series of images and really powerful looked at the testimony of these soldiers, right? Through their letters, they described the gas attacks, talking about the shell artillery. And remember, this is the war to end all wars. However, again, this is a war that will wage on for about 4 years total. All right, really when we talk about the legacy of World War I, in many ways, World War I we talk about as a new kind of war. It changed a lot of things. Reminder, World War I is considered a total war. It involved a new use of technology. It ushered in just the notion of war on a global scale. It also left behind a landscape of death and destruction which was never before seen. So both sides paid, I should say, a tremendous price of human life. Millions of soldiers died as a result of the war, and 21 million were wounded. So in addition, war led to death of countless civilians, and civilians we're talking about not people that were in the actual war, because they were suffering from starvation, disease. So taking all these together, the figures, the numbers, they spell out tragedy. The war, we have to mention too, also has a devastating impact economically on Europe. The Great Conflict really drained the treasuries or the bank accounts a lot of these European countries. So one account put a total cost of like $338 billion, which is a staggering amount, right? That billions of dollars sounds a lot in our time period, but that was a ginormous amount in this period we're looking at. The war also destroyed acres of farmland as well as homes, villages, and towns. So if we're talking about the building or the digging of the trenches and all those fortifications, right? In most cases, these were open fields, open land. Enormous suffering resulted of the Great War and left, we can imagine, a deep mark on Western society. So another significant legacy that I really want to focus on today is the peace agreement. So you will get to take a look at that when we start looking at that, I should say, in the Treaty of Versailles. All right, so on January 18th, 1919, a conference to establish the terms of what the peace treaty would look like began at the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris. Now, hopefully, Palace of Versailles sounds familiar. Right? We talked about that in our discussion of the French Revolution. That was the beautiful palace that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had lived in. So attending the talks known as the Paris Peace Conference, there were delegates or representatives from 32 different countries. For 1 year, this conference would be the scene of vigorous and bitter debate. The Allied powers kind of struggled how to solve their conflicting aims of the various peace treaties. Okay, so here's another taking a look at our big four, we like to call them. So despite that there was lots of countries involved at the Paris Peace Conference, the meeting's major decisions were really hammered out, known as a group, known as the Big Four. So the first one is going to be Woodrow Wilson, and that's our President of the United States, okay, which is figured here on the far right. We also have Georges Clemenceau, France. We have David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and we have Vittorio Orlando from Italy in that case. Now keep in mind, right, Russia at the time was in the grip of civil war. So we flash back to our discussion of the Russian Revolution, talking about Lenin, talking about Trotsky, right? And then we also need to note that Germany was not there and neither was its allies. Okay, so Germany is not included in these decisions. So the person who really steps up with the concept, I should say, even before we get to the Paris Peace Conference, is President Wilson. So President Wilson, our president at the time, was very much mindful of trying to, anticipate the close of the war and trying to think about what can we put into place to prevent the alliances and the competition, right, and that national pride that's so bitter. What can we do to really set the stage to make sure the world is a safe and peaceful place? And so Wilson started coming up with his ideas where basically the mindset was, right, the world lost total. There's no winners when we're talking about over 10 million people's lives were slaughtered. When we really look at it, right, it's an entire generation of young people extremely affected by this. So Wilson calls it, right, it's a peace without victory. There's no winners or losers. It's about we all lost something here. The main objective, right, is what can we learn from it and what can we do specifically to prevent a conflict like this happening again. So Wilson starts putting his eyes together, or his ideas, I should say, and he starts drawing up a series of proposals. So he calls these proposals the 14 points, and it's basically outlining his plan on which he thinks is a fair and lasting peace, right? We want to make sure everything's fair, okay, because there's no winners here if we're so devastated, and we want to make sure we're putting something, right, that's sustainable, something that's not going to just result in those alliances being created once more. So the first 4 points included the end of secret treaties, right? That was when we looked at the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. That was a situation that developed into those those dominoes put in place, and all we need is one event, one chain reaction like the assassination. He also talked about freedom of the seas, right, which is huge when we're talking about, for example, unrestricted submarine warfare. That was a type of technology that was introduced and it was used in World War I. He's also going to look at free trade, reduce national armies, reduce navies, right? The mindset that military buildup we thought would deter conflict, but actually it ended up pulling countries into conflict because they wanted to use their military, show off that scale, right? Also, you know, if you have weapons that are ready to use, perhaps again, if there is a conflict, you're able to use them versus really trying to settle your problems diplomatically in that case. The fifth goal was trying to adjust the colonial aims and the claims and fairness towards the people. So, right, trying to really figure out what's the world going to look like now after our discussion of imperialism. 6 through 13 points were kind of specific suggestions for changing borders, creating new nations. And the big idea behind this piece is Wilson calls it this concept of self-determination. So self-determination is the term we use. It basically means allowing people to decide for themselves under what government they actually want to live. So remember, in imperialism, right, you're under the government's power, the control, whether it's England or if it's looking at Germany, right? So self-determination allows people to choose that piece. So finally, the 14th point proposed a general association of nations. This would be an organization or a group, great and small states alike. And this reflected Wilson's hope for this organization to actually peacefully negotiate world conflicts. So he called this group known as the League of Nations. So the idea behind Wilson, he's basically thinking, right, if there was a place we could go to sit down literally at the table and negotiate and try to solve things diplomatically and try to work together to achieve common goals, that would be a profound way of making sure we not let this happen again. Now, fun fact, I know a lot of you have heard of an organization known as the United Nations, right, which is today put in place. Now, today, the United Nations has 93 countries belonging around the world. So kind of think of the League of Nations as the grandfather for the United Nations. Today, the United Nations makes sure they promote peace, security. They're trying to address global goals like poverty and gender equality. So this was the baby step, right? This was the first draft, so to speak, according to President Wilson, what the world needed in the post-World War I era. All right, so on the screen, very crystal clear, I want to remind you, there was no, as we close off World War I, there's not necessarily a decisive battle that's really going to seal the deal in this case. We don't have something, again, we see that ceasefire, right? We have that peace reached in November 1918. But for many reasons, we see that there's not necessarily, again, it goes back to there was no clear winner. Interesting enough, Germany also was kind of unaware of some of the losses it was experiencing. Now you can imagine, right, communication isn't the strongest back then. Today, right, technology, you can find instantaneous communication and also, news outlets and media postings, right? So for a lot of ways, German government also kind of, hid some of the things that were happening along the front lines. So Germany, again, also knew of President Wilson's ideas, and really it could be said Germany didn't realize, number one, that they had really lost, right? It just kind of, we're all stopping fighting and we're going to try to sit down and address this peace. And Germany only really surrendered because they thought peace treaty would be based on those 14 points that Wilson put into place.